4 continues our discussion on methodologies. There are a lot of theoretical approaches to decoding and understanding indigeneity. And so the methodologies that I'm suggesting or presenting here are only a few. I wish we had a lot more time to look at an array of methodologies, but there's a lot to cover in the course. But as we move on to Lesson 5 and beyond, I want you to remember that we'll drag methodology with us. We'll cover other domains, but they're going to require you to be aware of and use some systems for decoding the data and information that we cover. The title of Lesson 4 is Pragmatic Methodologies. Ethnographies, Philosophy, and Science. Now, ethnographies are those stories of a culture. They're not necessarily, they can be the cultural stories, a study of those and how they're told, and in the body language and the voice and the language. Those are ethnographic studies. But ethnographic studies themselves are studies. They're ways in which an observer conceptualizes the basic information that's witnessed in a cultural event. And by capturing that and coding it, you begin to take it apart and understand sort of the dynamics of what's going on within those cultural events. That's what ethnographic study is all about. Some people may question why I've included philosophy and science under the same heading of practical methodologies. Well, we should remember that even in Western thought, going back to the Greek philosophers, that philosophy and science were one, that they were not considered separate schools of thought, that the way that we conceptualize the universe philosophically had a lot to do with the way that we could understand it from a scientific point of view, a measurable point of view. And even today, and in the past, indigenous societies did not separate science from philosophy or from theology or spirituality. The intrinsic understandings of the universe and the way that we perceive it through philosophical lenses is often very, very close to and includes the scientific methods of various indigenous folks. And so we take ethnographies, which all of the authors have done, and they look at those ethnographies. Clearly, they've collected ethnographies from other people, and they've looked at it through a philosophical lens that attempts to capture the mode of the methodology, and then turn it into quantitative techniques that measure the quantitative data, produces quantitative data that can then provide a rational and understandable explanation for the ethnographic data, qualitative data. So that's why I call it pragmatic methodology. And I hope you enjoyed the readings today. I'm going to go over the readings with you right now so that we get, at least you get my point of view, on my take on what I ask you to read and why I ask you to read it. Jared Diamond gets a bit of criticism because he's a popular anthropological writer. He teaches at the University of California, and he's written a number of books which have looked at historical dynamics as well as anthropological considerations. He's collected a tremendous amount of other folks' ethnographic material and also collected some of his own. And generally what he offers us is a broad view of indigenous qualities of life. So, in this particular chapter, what he talks about is space and place, and how space and place are used by a number of indigenous groups. And he draws some parallels between these groups in order to establish a pattern. Space and place, I wanted to talk about that a little bit because in geography, in geographical studies, space is that territory that surrounds us. It may be a combination of the geographical terrain, the longitude, the latitude, the place it is on the globe. It could be the weather. It could include the weather. It does include the weather, and it includes the prevalent plants, the animals that inhabit the space. So that's sort of the space, and it's a general concept. When we talk about place, what we're talking about are the attributes that are assigned to space by human beings, and they're often culturally based. So when we talk about place, we can also talk about things like spatial identity or place identity, the name of a village, the name of a town, the name of a certain set of mountains, because that name carries with it abstract ideas that are associated with something beyond just its spatial quality. What Diamond does is he looks at a number of different places, or a number of different spaces, I should say. He looks at desert communities, he looks at equatorial Africa, he looks at New Guinea, he looks at some areas in South America and North America and also the Arctic. So, and what he's trying to do is say, is there something that's qualitatively human, humanly similar in these varied places, that's something that's similar among the human beings. And so he picks out, sort of cherry picks, I should say, some examples from all of these different places. Now, he also comes up with this idea that there's 4 components which really designate a level of human development in which people put a sense of ownership or proprietary possession of particular place. And so these are that the human population that occupies that space has to be large enough and dense enough to actually commit enough people to surveil on almost a 24-hour basis the incursion of strangers. So it's an exclusive place. It only includes those who belong. So in terms of proprietorship, it creates a sense of belonging, but it also creates a sense of exclusion. But it also has to be enforced by a population that's big enough and dense enough to surveil it, to keep strangers out. The territory must be productively stable enough to meet the needs of the population. So it must have resources that are worth protecting. That it's inclusive, but also it has enough resources to support the population that's there to protect it. The area must contain valuable assets, capital improvements that require protection and are worth dying for. So in order to protect land, you have to sometimes put your life on the line, or in an altruistic way, make sure that you protect that territory. You can claim ownership of it once you're able to protect it. He also points out that group membership must be consistent without an in or out migration. that those who live in that protected territory, those who claim proprietorship of that territory, do not want to move out of it and will resist others moving into it. So, and that has to do with attitude. And later on in the other reading by Peter Turchin, he's going to talk a bit about the kind of attitudes that have to form among populations that develop that kind of contingent attitude, that type of contingent point of view, so that you keep people out and you also have such a sense of belonging you do not want to leave. Because he also talks about the etiquette of neighbors and how there are neighbors who can ask permission. So those on the marchland, those on the boundary, can cross the boundary and ask permission to use an asset in times of scarcity, but also in times of abundance. So if there's a tremendous power of abundance, then people are invited to share in that. And that creates a goodwill, and also that goodwill reinforces the exclusivity in times of maybe when times are tough. So I think that section on sort of land sharing etiquette is very important. I'm not going to go through the entire reading in this way. I think just to get you started thinking about some of the themes that are covered by Diamond. He does, toward the end, talk about trade, because trade is one of those issues that breaks down or requires a certain kind of an etiquette of its own. Because in order to enhance compatibility, in order to enhance a good quality of life, trade is always necessary, because you may not have the particular stones that are required to make the best points. So you want to trade for that. You may not have shells to fashion into tools or jewelry. So you may want to trade for that, because those become desired items. And so trade is an exception. It allows people to cross territories. It allows people to enter territories and stay for a while, as long as the trade negotiations and the trade relations are being acted out. However, trade does not necessarily establish ownership of resources, and it does not establish an ownership of land or property. This week we're going to read another chapter in Stone Age Economies by Solons, and I want to make a bit of an apology for Solons because some of his language and the syntax that he uses is a bit out of date. We have to remember that this book was written some 60 years ago. At the time, it was groundbreaking. And in fact, Solon's work is still being quoted by authors today, because it was cutting edge 60 years ago, and it's still cutting edge today. I particularly like his style because I find it to be honest and straightforward. So that's my apology for Solons. He, in the chapter that I want you to read this week, called The Structure of Underproduction, he really explores that idea of how Indigenous societies maintained a lack of surplus, and how their work and their daily routines established that as a status quo. He does this throughout the chapter by accounting for economic activity. He qualifies his method from the start. Basically, what he says is he's going to look at the practical means of agriculture, and he chooses agriculture because it's much easier to accumulate positive data uh, over a period of time from agricultural production than it is from herding or hunting and gathering. So he's chosen something that's simple and straightforward, again, that we can get our heads around. Now, as a baseline, what he looks at in the methodology is the carrying capacity of the land that's being occupied. So he looks at the extent of the territory, and he also looks at the population level, how many people are present, and the density within the territory. So the territory size and density is taken into consideration, as well as the size of the population. And he takes that and divides the carrying capacity of the land or the environment by those factors. And he also then takes a look at the hours of work that it takes to produce enough food for subsistence means. Now, and along the way, he has a running commentary where he challenges his own methodology at times, but also establishes data from a number of ethnographic studies to show that that there's an actual structure of underproduction. He talks about three elements of the domestic mode of production. Small labor force differentiated by sex, so men and women doing different jobs, sometimes doing the same job, but often doing different jobs or working at different times of the day. Simple technology, so no machines, simple tools where you cultivate the land, remove weeds, do the chores that basic agriculture requires. And he also looks at the third element is finite production objectives. So they're not growing for sale, they're not growing for trade or big party, I don't know, but just really finite production objectives, that of subsistence. So those are the conditions that he places upon the labor force or the labor status quo within various locations that he pulls ethnographic material from. So what he's offering us is a quantitative analysis based upon variables. What we don't get in this ethnographic study and methodology to quantify data are personal attitudes. We don't get the direct feedback. We're only looking at raw data and trying to analyze it in terms of an economic regime. But we don't get the actual personal attitudes from individuals about what they think of their work and what they think of their produce, whether it creates pride or whether they're just lackadaisical. So we don't have any information that really confirms that type of thing. In the 1970s, there was a study by Studs Terkel, and he published it in a book called Work, in which what he did is he looked at a variety of North American workers, from factory workers to shopkeepers to farmers and different trades like plumbing and carpentry. And he asked people, what do you work for? What's the purpose of your work? So it was a different type of ethnographic study that he was looking at, because what he was looking at was to discover the attitudes about work, personal labor, a personal commitment to the work that people do. And he was looking for their justification for why they do what they want to do or what they do. So different types of study. And Solons tells us that that's his own criticism of the methodology that he's using. Solons, continues in this analysis and points out that what the statistics tell us is that some domestic modes of production, units, some families produce more than others. In fact, some produce more than they personally need, and there are other families that produce less than what is needed for subsistence. Some families fail. Now, he's trying to understand that as well. So one of the comments he makes is this, is that in domestic modes of production, Solon states, and I'll quote him here, how labor is to be expended, the terms and products of its activity are in the main domestic decisions. And these decisions are taken primarily with a view toward domestic contentment. So, attitudes do play a large role in the amount of productivity that takes place within the domestic mode of production. And those attitudes are based on husband, wife, children, dependents, grandparents, having a sense of contentment with the amount of leisure and the amount of work that's provided and the products of that work. Solons also makes some personal observations, and I think this is reasonable when we're looking at a scientist who's going to philosophize a little bit about his work. He makes this point, is that the use of tools and how the relationship can be calculated. He writes this, in primitive relations of man to tool, the balance is in favor of the man. The man provides energy, skill, and intelligence, and that way he has control over the means of production. With the inception of the machine, he goes on to say, the balance swings definitely in favor of the machine. And that is much of what Marx had to say about the machine production age, is that once the machine takes over, the man serves the machine rather than the machine serving the man. Finally, Solons engages us with a comparison between capitalism and domestic modes of production. That's not surprising so much because he started the book telling us that anthropologists see through a lens of capitalism, and that because of that they have misjudged, miscalculated the kind of work and the kind of economies that indigenous people have. So ending this chapter with a bit of an analysis of capitalism and domestic modes of production is important. And of course what he points out is that there's a difference. And the difference is that with domestic modes of production, it's production for use of the material that's produced. And in a modern age, in the capitalist age, it's production for exchange and for value plus, value added, so that there's an exponential growth of the economy rather than a stable state status quo. So, all worth considering. It's I think, a really important chapter. We're going to do another chapter or two in the book before we're done with it. So I'm really looking forward to your discussion of his methodology as well as what you learn about indigenous economies. Historical Dynamics by Peter Turchin is an astounding book. When I assigned it and wrote a little bit under the on-cue headings, I suggested that the two chapters that I've assigned for reading would be excruciating for some students. I think that's particularly true of the first chapter that I assigned, chapter 2. But on third or fourth reading, I've come to appreciate what Peter Turchin is really trying to do in chapter 2. In fact, he is one of the clearest writers that we can read. he gives us the clue right from the beginning. He says this: rather than starting immediately with geopolitical models, I first review some basic facts about general kinds of behaviors that can be exhibited by dynamical systems. And behaviors, what he's referring to, is the growth of a population or the expansion of a population or even the decline of a population. Those are the kind of behaviors that he's talking about. And he writes this: although these facts are largely elementary, they are worth discussing because, one, they may not be well known to people lacking extensive experience with dynamic models. And it gives me a chance to introduce a simple classification system to which I can then refer throughout the book. And that's the kind of clear writing that Peter Turchin is renowned for. Well, what he suggests is that he's also going to deal with spatial aspects. So we can equate what Turchin has to say with Jared Diamond and his accounts of indigenous space and place, and how their behaviors within indigenous people's behaviors within space and place occur. Because the dynamics that Turchin talks about are not only qualities that can be used to understand empires, but also human groups and ethnic groups in a lot of different locations. And so in terms of spatial aspects, he divides it into sort of two categories for these dynamics to take place. Is one, the ability to project power over a distance. So if a group or an ethnicity or an empire for that matter, or a indigenous tribal group, they lay claim to their territory because they can project power over a distance. They can establish boundaries and borders to their territory. And there's also the component of the variables that are involved with the effects of the position that they hold, whether it's in the interior of their territory or whether it may be on closer to one of the boundaries, whether they're in a position where there's many neighbors or few neighbors, or whether there's a collection of highly dense but small territories around them, or large territories that are less dense. And so aspects of position matter a lot in terms of the kind of dynamics that are involved in migration, expansion, and reducing the amount of territory that one group has over another. And what he suggests in Chapter 2, and why Chapter 2 is difficult for many people, is that there's a sentential calculus way of determining particular modes of occupation. And for instance, right from the start, he gives us 6 ways to measure the trajectory of the rise of density, the number of the increase in population, and but he also, 2 of these include the decline of a population, decline in density, decline of influence of a particular group or ethnicity over a certain amount of space. It's a really important kind of analysis because it's a quantitative measurement of behaviors that are largely qualitative in nature. And in Chapter 3, he really begins to expand that because what he points out is that there's a sociology of groups that largely affects the qualitative behavior of groups, not just their position, not just their ability to extend themselves, but there's factors that contribute to that within their sociology. And so these characteristics of groups are fairly important. He introduces us to Ibn Khaldun, who we'll read later in the course, who is an Islamic scholar from the 14th century. And he gives us a pretty extensive understanding of Khaldun's theory of what's known as asabiya, which is considered the attitude of a group. In this way, he describes how a group forms around central ideas and how those ideas control their development in large measure. He talks about the characteristic of groups to draw social boundaries, because there are those territorial boundaries, but there's also social boundaries. And these social boundaries create capacity for group-oriented action. So when a group identifies itself as a group, then it's capable of the group itself forming action. And that depends upon recognition of markers. They could be racial markers, they could be ethnic markers, they could be a language, particular customs, or signs that people use to self-identify as members of a group. And these accents may be cultural, intending to differentiate and show sort of preferences. But he also notes that they may be also biologically related in a neurological hardwiring. The fact is that our distant hominid ancestors had to identify those who were friends and foes, those who had potential intentions of taking over their territory. So the fact is that we have those senses still rooted within us, and we have interpreted them in a cultural form, so that we have prejudices against those who are outgroups, and we have prejudices of acceptance for those who we consider part of our in-group. Turchin goes on and explores solidaristic behaviors and group cohesion. And that's where Khaldun comes in, because the theory of asabiya is one where something as abstract as religion can unite a whole bunch of people and override the idea of markers. For instance, religion can override the racial distinctions or ethnic distinctions. But something like religion can also set a social boundary. So people who speak the same language, have the same ethnicity, or many of the other social characteristics they may share. But if they're different, if they accept different religions, then that may actually create prejudices which do not support a mutual asabiya. Turchin claims that ethnicities form the most distinct groups, with the sharpest boundaries, the strongest boundaries between the in-group and the out-group. And they do this through feelings of solidarity. Turchin goes on in chapter 3 to talk about several of the other theories of group solidarity. He talks about Gumilev from Russia, who has a theory that describes sort of ethnogenic theory. Growth and development are generated by passion of individuals, messiahs of sorts, those who can demonstrate terrific passion for an ideology. So he describes this, and he also describes the social psychology of Durkheim, who talks about the kind of attitudinal attachments that groups have for one another. The point that Turchin wants to make is that societies and groups are complex. And I particularly like Turchin's analysis because he's willing to entertain the intersection between culture, ecology, and biology. And in this way, we have someone who's a bit of an ally with Indigenous theory. The fact that his emphasis is on the rise and fall of nations is not so important to us as the dynamics that he talks about in terms of migration, cultural change, and the changing patterns, what Alexander Dugin in Russia calls ethnokinetics. And so Turchin helps us understand the qualities and the components, the aspects of social change and development within all sorts of societies.